I'm Josh. I play to win. I'm not a fluffy player, I'm a crunchy player. It basically means I really like the rules. The lore is important, but the rules are the most important thing to me. The intention of this series is to help you win. It's not to conform to some moral, arbitrary code that some neckbeard in a comic book store made up. It's to crush those people. Sometimes that's going to mean building a filth or cheese list. It means putting a lot of the same units into one list and hurling them at your opponent. List building is a time frame before playing the game where you could lose even before placing a miniature on the battlefield. A lot of players like to argue that that part of the game shouldn't be as important as it is, but I'd like to argue that that's a huge part of the strategy in this game. To win this game, you need to be able to build a winning list. If I show up to an event with a lot of low-rend minis and try to attack my opponents in a meta where everyone's playing resilient high-save models, I'm probably going to lose. And the outcome was not determined when I hit the table, it was determined when I built my list. So list building is part of the game, and it occurs the moment you decide to participate in a local event or against another player. I'm basically trying to tell people why it's important to build winning lists. You will lose if you don't. The first thing I want to talk about is the rules. The rules are the most important part of this game. If you're going to build a list, you better know the rules. I can't tell you how many times I've been to a tournament where I've run into a player and they've lost the game because they didn't know the rules of the game. Many times players will bring a list that they haven't practiced or they've only played once, so they don't really understand their list until they get halfway through the tournament and they've already lost 2 to 3 games. They're kicking themselves in the pants saying, man, I really wish I practiced my list and knew the rules because A, I would have taken different things, and B, I would have played better. So the most important thing about list building is knowing the rules. If you have a battle tome, make sure you read that book front to back. Study it to death, especially if you're entering a tournament. I owned 3 copies of the Blades of Khorne battle tome. I don't own 3 copies because I love the book. I own 3 copies because it fell apart. I was studying it to the point of exhaustion. The book is completely destroyed. It's important. You need to read your book. You need to know every rule. If it says on a 6 or on a 6 up or on a 6 before modifiers, pay attention to those things. They're super important. And they'll allow you to form the winning combinations in your army that'll help you win the game and defeat your opponent. Now I want to talk about unit roles. Unit roles are just generic roles. There can be exceptions. They're things that a unit is good for. An example might be a supporting role. In addition to that, a unit can perform multiple roles. So you're not just secluded to one specific role. In addition, if you have a supporting unit that, say, buffs a certain characteristic on a certain unit, it may transform from a chaff or screening role to a striking role and be able to deal some significant damage. So roles can shift and change on the fly, but it's important to recognize roles in your own army and in your opponent's army so you can recognize threats and figure out what makes your opponent's army tick so you can defeat it. Today we're going to talk about 6 different unit types which I typically identify when I'm building lists. Those unit types are support, striking, zoning, tar pit, reactive, and screening/chaff units. So the first role we're going to talk about is the support role. Support units are any unit with an ability to heal or provide a buff to allied units or debuff to enemy units. Now what's so significant about support units is that they are actually able to shift the role of the other units in the army. I can give you a great example of this where the Bloodsecrator. The Bloodsecrator allows you to transform your chaff units or your Blood Reavers in my case into something that's a lot more killy. Or, for example, I could use bronze flesh with my slaughter priest to provide resiliency to my blood warriors or my blood crushers. The bottom line is that support units allow you to shift the role of one unit to another type. And sometimes that means changing the role of your opponent's units as well. For example, with Bellicor, if my opponent has a poor wound roll already, and I depreciate his wound roll further with his debuff modifier with his spell, I could turn my opponent's striking unit into almost a sort of chaff unit and hopefully defeat him that way. But the most important thing to remember is that supporting units allow you to either shift the role of one unit to the role of another type, and in addition to that, they could make a resilient unit more resilient. So that is really the role of a support unit. At least in my eyes. You can feel free to comment about that in the comments below. Striking units are any type of unit that is intended to deal significant damage. There are amounts of damage that every unit can deal, right? But some units are intended strictly to hit your opponent really hard. Let's take Scarbrand, for example. Almost everything about Scarbrand is revolving around his ability to deal massive, consistent damage. Or Bloodletters, or Brutes in Ironjaws, or Stonehorn, for example. They're all heavy striking units in melee combat. These are your units that you're going to use to wipe out your enemy's front lines and hopefully break through them and deal significant damage to the heart of their forces, namely their support units. The next unit we're going to talk about is zoning units. Zoning units are ranged units. Any ranged units, in fact. They're any unit that can, any unit with a ranged ability or attack that poses a threat to the enemy if they come within range. They typically stay close enough to the action to have an impact on the battle, but avoid being within range of an attack. Most zoning units function within the missile phase, but some function within the hero phase. So your wizards and your slaughter priests and your I think there's a couple in the Stormcast armies. But typically you have your ranged units, which create sort of this invisible bubble that you have to avoid with your own units, at least on your opponent's turn. And those are the zoning units. Some armies revolve around zoning units entirely, almost entirely. Cadron Overlords. I think I'm saying that right. Is that? It's Caradron Overlords. But, there's also weird ones like the Jabber Scythe with its, strange area of effect abilities. The next one is Tar Pits. Tar Pit units have a high level of resiliency. Basically, you throw these guys in front of your opponent and they stick around for at least a turn or two of combat. Typically, you'll send them up against your opponent's biggest threat, depending on whether or not they counter that type of resiliency. Because quite frankly, resiliency comes in all shapes and sizes. You've got models that come back from the dead, like skeletons or zombies. And you've got death saves, or Nurgle's Rotting Flesh, I think it's called. You've also got resiliency in the form of half damage, like the Tomb King's Necrosphinx or Stonehorn. And you've got forms of resiliency where there's just a high number of wounds. So there's all sorts of different flavors of resiliency, but typically your Tar Pit units are going to take advantage of that in some way, shape, or form, and tie up your opponent's best units for a round of combat or two, so that way they can't hit your good stuff. That's what a Tar Pit's for. The next thing I want to talk about is one of my favorite type of units, which are reactive units. Reactive units are a unit that poses some sort of threat when you attempt to strike them. A good example of this might be Fanatics, where when you charge a unit that contains Fanatics, your opponent can pop them out and stop you from making a charge. Or Aether Wings, they do a very similar thing, where they'll stop your charge by moving up the field and charging you themselves. I think Fanatics are a little better at it, though. Another great example, Wrathmongers. Wrathmongers are great. When you kill a Wrathmonger, they get to pick an enemy unit within 2 or 3 inches, and that unit can attack itself or another enemy unit around it. So really good reactive ability. And Blood Warriors are another fine example of that. Some of the more unique ones might be the Razordons from the Seraphim, where if you make a charge and end it within 3 inches of them, the unit can, and instantly, the entire unit can make a shooting attack on the unit that made its charge. So there's a lot of really cool reactive units, and they don't typically have high defense the same way a tar pit does. Occasionally do. Typically they're meant to die and or defend another unit and deal significant damage to the enemy unit if they charge or if they make an attack. It's kind of like a pain point for your opponent. You're not going to get me without me doing some damage to you, and it really makes your opponent think about who they're going to attack with, and occasionally it causes them to make some mistakes so you can punish them. I love reactive units. I play them all the time, and it really makes my opponents cringe. The last unit I want to talk about is a pretty obvious one. It is the chaff/screening unit. These are typically cheap, inexpensive troops that you can place all over the battlefield for area denial. Typically, they might cost you anywhere between 60 and 100 points for 10 or more models, and you push them up the field so that way your opponent runs into them, they kill the 100-point unit, and you're able to make a successful charge in subsequent turns and hopefully kill your opponent's more important stuff. So just to reiterate, there are 6 different types of unit roles, at least in my eyes. There are support units, which allow you to shift or modify the role of a unit or enemy unit. Striking units, which are your damage dealing units. Zoning units, which are your ranged missile and hero phased based units. Tar pit units, which are your high resilient models that are meant to halt your enemy and tie them up for multiple turns. Reactive units, which are meant to cause your enemy pain when they attempt to attack you or strike you. And then finally, chaff or screening units, which are cheap units that are meant to hold or staff your enemy off for 1 round of combat. Lastly, I'd like to mention that you don't need all of these roles in your army or in your list. You can win with any number of them as long as you're able to identify what we'll be talking about next week, which is winning moves. Winning moves or being able to identify winning moves just simply means, how am I going to take this army and win with it? What did you think of all my different unit roles? I'm interested in your thoughts. I'm sure there's some that I missed. These are the ones that I tend to identify when I play against my opponents. Of course, there are things that I'm going to talk about in the future, like identifying different types of abilities that cause mortal wounds, for example, or high rend damage. But I don't typically categorize those into the realm of roles. I thought about including a role called a mortal wound outlet, but I think that falls more into the striking role, and it's almost like a subset of the striking role. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on my ideas regarding unit roles, and if you can think of any yourself. Feel free to comment below, and thanks for watching.